for us to have time together outside of class to talk about the humanities in general. And each forum has a reception afterwards. Usually these are in the great room, like today. Please join us afterwards this afternoon down the hallway in the great room for some good food and more conversation. We have a special guest with us today. To introduce our guest, please join me in welcoming Professor Fred Dragula from the History and Classics Department.
Thank you very much. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce one of our greatest scholars in ancient Greek literature, Dr. Geoffrey Henderson. It's a daunting and perhaps impossible task to give proper credit to his academic distinctions in such a short space, but I will certainly try. Dr. Henderson received his PhD from Harvard University and is currently the William Goodwin Aurelio Professor of Greek Language and Literature at Boston University. He has also served as the Dean of Arts and Sciences there and was the founding director of the honors program. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a former Guggenheim Fellow, and he has served as the president of the American Philological Association. And he is particularly well known to students and scholars of the humanities as the general editor of the Loeb Classical Library, which publishes authoritative editions and translations of ancient writers in Greek and Latin. Some of you know this series of books, which now runs to over 500 volumes, I believe. But all of you have seen it before. Every time you go into the Providence College Library, there's a wall of little green and red books off to your left. That's the Loeb Classical Library that he is the general editor of. Dr. Henderson is a prodigious scholar. By my count, he is the author of 15 books and nearly 50 scholarly articles. His first book, The Immaculate Muse, Obscene Language and Attic Comedy, remains the authoritative text for understanding the nuances and usages of obscenity in Greek plays, and it started him on his distinguished career that has made him the world's leading scholar on Aristophanes, the ancient Athenian comic playwright whose theatrical productions were hysterical, saucy, and ruthless commentaries on the world of classical Greece. Dr. Henderson has published translations of all of Aristophanes' plays, and such is his mastery of Greek and his skill as a translator, that last week my Western Civ students were simultaneously engrossed, delighted, and scandalized while reading his translation of Lysistrata. More recently, Dr. Henderson has turned his attention to other authors, publishing translations of the Greek poet Longus, the novelist Xenophon of Ephesus, and the historian and biographer Xenophon of Athens. But the lure of Aristophanes is strong, and he is now working on a new authoritative edition of the play The Knights. Years ago, I was fortunate enough to study a few of Aristophanes' plays with Dr. Henderson while I was studying at Boston University, so I know firsthand that in addition to being a prodigious scholar, he is a truly warm, generous teacher who is devoted to his students. A marvelous scholar and educator and a champion of the humanities, we are very fortunate to have him here today. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Dr. Henderson.
That's good. Can everybody hear me now? Thank you, Fred. That was true. That was actually over the top. I'll take it. But very kind of you. It's always good to see your students succeed and go on and follow in your footsteps, even though we miss them. There are always new ones coming up, though. So it's good to see such a good turnout from our humanists and friends of the humanities of the future. I'm very pleased to have this introduction and grateful for the opportunity to participate in the 2016 forum, and hope we can have fun with this topic, which 25 years ago wouldn't have been considered appropriate for a decent gathering, and 50 years ago, when I was a student, would have been illegal. So I do warn you, though, that this is an R-rated presentation. It's not my fault. The hierarchy of the forum suggested that I speak about this, so it's a welcome chance to revisit an early passion of mine for Aristophanic obscenity. Those of you who have sampled Aristophanes in modern translations will know that in addition to his affectionate but trenchant satire of the human condition, Aristophanes' world-class sense of the absurd and its strange logic, his wonderful lyrics and his soaring fantasy, he has been famed since antiquity for his outspokenness and plain speaking, with little political correctness in the way. Outspokenness not only in the service of political satire, but also to have fun with sex and obscenity in all of its varieties. Given the lewd, crude, and nasty character of our current political climate, and the idea that this is somehow beneath where politics should be, I thought it would be interesting today to look back after 2,500 years at how Aristophanes put sex and politics together in the world's first democracy, which at that time was only one generation old. Aristophanes' father had not known real democracy. So this was new for everybody. And Aristophanes took advantage as a teenager, which he was when he wrote his first play, to inject this element of reality into his portrayal and satire of politics, consistently using sex and obscenity as ingredients in his satire. And you wonder why he was allowed to do this in the first place? Because his audiences, the same audiences that watched plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, had strict rules of propriety as regards sex and obscenity in their everyday lives, and that included politics. We find no obscenities in Greek oratory, and even vivid sexual metaphors are rare. And a generation after Aristophanes, this sort of thing vanished even from the comic stage. So, what allowed Aristophanes and his fellow poets to be so politically raunchy? What did this element contribute to the plays overall? How would the satire have been less effective without it? And why might the audiences have wanted sex and obscenity in the plays? Those audiences included children who, Aristophanes tells us, particularly enjoyed the obscenity and the long dangling phallus worn by the comic actors. They also included women. When we read these plays, we should keep in mind that they were that the audience for their plays was inclusive. It was the largest audience that assembled during the year for anything, the theatrical audiences, and they were open to anyone. So in a way, the audiences looked in on the political class. In democratic Athens, only citizen males 18 and above were eligible for any civic rights. Women, children, slaves, foreigners, all of them without the franchise. So at the theater, uniquely, a public spectacle, this demos of the democracy, the people of the democracy, were outnumbered by the non-franchised slaves and women and children. So in a way, holding their democracy up to ridicule was a way of exposing it to a wider audience than usually was allowed to assemble in Athens. We're familiar today with the concept of dirty politics as practiced both by satirists and by politicians themselves, exploiting scandal as a way of undermining the character and credibility of opponents. This goes back a ways. In my first election, the election of Richard Nixon in 1968, cartoonist Herblock, here he comes now out of the gutter. Hillary Clinton and her scandalous years in the White House. Then there's the hands of Donald Trump. Do you remember this episode earlier in the campaign when Marco Rubio commented that Donald Trump has unusually small hands? And you know what that means. And Donald Trump knew what this means and assured us all that there's no problem there, which set off a volley of satirical hand photoshopping. This obviously can include family members, not usually children, but certainly wives. Here's an ad from Ted Cruz about Melania Trump. Meet your next first lady. And the rumor that she used to be an escort. Here's another picture that was circulated. Trump is now suing over this image and parading Bill Clinton's accusers to kind of rebut these charges. But generally, our dirty politics, even these, are comparatively tame. There are no four-letter words or outright sexual indecency, at least in the public media. It's easy to find more scurrilous stuff online. Here's an example, but you wouldn't find this even on Fox News, let alone CNN. This is quite a below, but not too far below. In defining dirty or obscene or inappropriate politics, there's no absolute or universal standard. What's obscene or indecent varies from culture to culture and era to era, and even pundit to pundit. If we say it's just locker room talk, we have athletes now complaining that that isn't locker room talk. Who are you talking about? Not us. I never heard that in my locker room. So is locker room different from the parlor? You decide. A few weeks ago, Philippines President Duterte said "son of a whore" while talking about Obama. And after expressions of outrage from the Western press and the cancellation of his meeting with Obama, he insisted it was just an interjection that he uses all the time and not a description of our esteemed president. But presidential politics in America haven't always been so tame. For example, the election of 1828 between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. John Quincy Adams was supposedly the pimp who procured young girls for Tsar Alexander when he was minister to Russia. And Andrew Jackson, the son of a common prostitute brought to the country by the British soldiers. These things are completely untrue, but they are ways of diminishing the stature and reputation of the victims. Important in any political context is how such ingredients are intrinsic to the culture. Are they an extension of normal political discourse or normal cultural discourse, or are they perceived to be intrusive or inappropriate? And often we look to the proper culture, the high culture, media, art, religion, literature, in our day, film, television, theater, the ways that the culture shows itself off as a civilized culture. Are sexual, obscene, dirty elements in political discourse continuous with that, or are they alien to it? And that's often the distinction. Are they improper? Times have certainly changed since I entered college in 1964. Public obscenity, verbal or in print, was still illegal. You could actually go to jail, as did Lenny Bruce in 1962 for saying fuck and tits in his stand-up comedy show. Off to jail. And of course, graphic depictions of sex, both verbal and visual pornography, were illegal. Times were changing, however. Potter Stewart and the beginning of the principle known as community standards. Hardcore pornography, that is pornography that can be considered illegal, according to Stewart, is hard to define, but I know it when I see it. The definition depends on the viewer. This community standard was famously tested in 1972 by George Carlin. I don't know if you remember him. You can find this on YouTube. This is a very famous routine. These are the words that you can't say. 7 dirty words, routine. It's still well worth seeing. And this 7 dirty words act of George Carlin at the bitter end went to the Supreme Court again. Carlin was busted for obscenity. This came before the Supreme Court, which now ruled that indecent material was protected by the First Amendment. It wasn't only in the eye of the beholder, but it was protected speech, though it could be regulated on air. And so not between 6 and 10 p.m. Could anything like this be shown. Is that still true, by the way, on broadcast television? Well, children were supposedly in bed then, but that was before cell phones and so forth, and cable. In any case, the legalities were still unclear in 1971, just 45 years ago, when I began my PhD dissertation at Harvard on sexual and scatological language in Aristophanes. This topic had never been systematically studied. That's the reason that it appealed to me as a dissertation. I was a Latinist, and for one reason or another, my Latin dissertation topic fell through, so I needed a topic that I could write on quickly, and didn't have any bibliography. So I always liked this stuff, and I said, why not? And of course, none of this material had been incorporated in any translation of Aristophanes at that time either. So this was open territory. Most of the faculty tried to dissuade me from writing on this topic. They were sure no one would publish it, for one thing, even if there were people interested in reading about such a topic, which they doubted. Worse, would they or the university be criminally liable? One professor suggested that I write the dissertation in Latin. Not an outlandish idea, since that is how obscenity was normally rendered in classical editions and dictionaries, when it wasn't simply omitted. I mean, even the Loeb Classical Library in those days used Latin to translate questionable passages of Latin and Greek. And the injunction was no material that might offend. It's interesting that obscenity was considered translatable and printable if it was in Latin. The first Loeb editor of the Roman poet Martial rendered the obscenity in Italian, very literally. But as long as it wasn't in English, it was okay, I guess. Latin being a scientific language and Italian being a notoriously racy language, I guess it was okay. Fortunately, Professor Zeph Stewart stepped up to help me. None other than Justice Potter Stewart's brother, who was a Harvard professor. Even though he had no interest in the subject, he thought it was worth investigating, as now it would be legal to do so. In fact, he himself was quietly arranging to have Loeb translations de-Baudelarized whenever they were revised, beginning with Petronius's Satyricon in 1969, just when the Supreme Court had said it was okay. Zeph Stewart, who was then the executive trustee of the Loeb Library, started quietly to have the Loebs revised to reflect the actual text that they were translating. In the event, no police came calling. The field welcomed my results. Yale University Press was happy to publish The Immaculate Muse in 1975, and then Oxford Press in 1991. It's still in print, as are my unexpurgated translations of Aristophanes' plays themselves. Those translations were the first fully unexpurgated translations of Aristophanes. They began to be published in the 1990s and still ran into trouble here and there. The culture wars were picking up steam in the 90s, as evidenced in this notice to humanists from our government in 1989. None of the funds authorized to be appropriated for the National Endowment for the Humanities may be used to promote, disseminate, or produce materials which, in the judgment of the National Endowment for the Humanities, may be considered obscene, including, but not limited to, depictions of sadomasochism, homoeroticism, the sexual exploitation of children, or individuals engaged in sex acts, which, when taken as a whole, do not have serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. I could only hope at the time that the art and literature of classical Greece, which frequently depicts each one of these banned subjects, would be among the materials judged serious, even in the case of Aristophanes. And one issue we'll look at is, why did Aristophanes put these things in? Did he do it to offend or shake people up, or did he did it because they would just accept it as in natural course? So there's a place also for provocative or countercultural material in satire. It wasn't all smooth sailing, despite the Supreme Court, given the standards of some communities. Police in Ohio, for example, closed down a production of my translation of Lysistrata and asked me to prove that I was not a pornographer who had written the play, but merely the translator of the play, which was a classic play. So I was able to do that by furnishing my CV. But it's remarkable how the same play becomes acceptable if it's a classic. Again, it's like the Latin, that there's a certain taboo or fetishistic aspect of this material. It all depends on the setting and the point of including it, even in a work of art. It took a while for people to accept that anything classic could contain obscene material to begin with. For years, students from all over the world would regularly write to me to ask whether these things were really in there, had I not inserted them myself. I haven't had any such inquiries lately, but maybe because people don't use email anymore. How many of you use email? Okay. One of my students told me last semester that I was the only person that she ever wrote emails to. And didn't I want to get on Snapchat or something to communicate like a human being? Anyway, but I think there are people that wonder, is that really in there? What about the classical Greeks? Aren't they an ideal culture? Well, times have changed enormously in recent decades. Nevertheless, political obscenity on the Aristophanic level is still impossible, even in our more tolerant environment of 2016. The snickers about Melania, or even Adams and Jackson, pale, I think, before what the comic poets said about their ancient counterparts, like Aspasia. Aspasia of Miletus, from an aristocratic family, girlfriend of the wealthy populist leader Pericles, whom you will know through his portrayal in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. You won't hear any of this scandal in the pages of Thucydides, however, but you will hear it in the comic poets. Not only Aristophanes, but Cratinus, in his play Chirons, says, "Loose bootiness bore him a Hera, that concubine with a bitch's face." This is about Aspasia and Pericles. In mythological guise, they were portrayed as Zeus and Hera and Helen of Troy and so forth. Other comic poets piled on her in similar fashion, even alleging that she was a pimp and arranged liaisons for Pericles with other men's wives. Aristophanes even attributed the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War to Aspasia's sex trafficking. This is how the war broke out. Some drunken kids went to Megara and kidnapped the whore Simaitha. And then the Megarians, pumped up by pain and retaliation, stole a couple of Aspasia's whores. And from that, the onset of the war broke forth upon all the Greeks because of 3 cocksuckers. A little bit over the top, but this was apparently political gossip of the day about the leading statement. Athens in Aristophanes' day was a democracy and did protect the right of frank speech, parrhesia, at least for adult male citizens. Still, obscene speech was by custom not tolerated in serious fora, assemblies or law courts, for example, and is never found in serious poetry like tragedy or in polite conversation. On the other hand, Aristophanes' Athens, unlike our modern world, did not consider sexuality harmful or dirty, had no religious or moral objection to obscenity, and didn't consider obscenity harmful, vulgar, or off limits to females or bad for children. Sexuality and obscenity, the direct expression of taboo body parts and activity, had nothing directly to do with guilt or morality, and the rules governing their use were not expressions of strong internalized feeling that the taboo parts and activity were degrading and disgusting. Shame did surround sexuality, but its source seems to be embarrassment about bodily functions rather than guilt. In other words, modesty instead of guilt. It's within the general structure of respectful behavior and decorum that these rules found their place. The general principle was that taboo body parts and sexual activity were avoided or required to disguise in formal contexts. Nevertheless, and importantly, there were traditionally sanctioned outlets for obscenity that could be enjoyed by the whole community, including women, children, and slaves. there were various religious cults, especially the cults of Demeter, the Earth Mother, and Dionysus, the god of wine and fertility. And there was iambos, a traditional genre of poetry from which we get iambic meter, that accommodated lampoons and personal attacks. Iambic obscenity served to expose the intimate lives of enemy to ridicule. Here's a sample from a papyrus text of a poem by Hipponax, who predates Aristophanes by a century or so, describing how he had sex with the wife or daughter of his enemy, Bupalus. There's a whole series of poems from Hipponax attacking this fellow villager, Bupalus, in obscene fashion. So Aristophanes didn't invent this kind of attack. The obscene language and sexual details were an effective way to rub in the insult and make it more outrageous. And at the festivals, sexuality was associated with fertility, so that obscenity, the most direct way of identifying sexuality, played a positive role for the community. Even a magical one, since evil spirits, spirits that could harm fertility, affect the crops or the animals, were thought to dislike obscenity. So the more you whooped it up at the festival, the more the cooties and goblins and bad spirits would be chased away. There's nothing wrong with phallic monuments. Here's the enclosure at Delos. The sacred enclosure of Apollo is protected by monumental phalli. And this is good, because again, evil spirits will not penetrate that perimeter, and it encourages the celebration and acknowledgement of the importance of fertility. As far as the theater goes, ancient plays were performed in honor of the god Dionysus, and so the phallus is a principal emblem of the Greek theater. On the opening day of the theatrical festival every year, you would have a phallic procession to escort the god Dionysus into the theater, where he sat in the front row seat, and he would be escorted in on a wagon with satyrs, people dressed up as satyrs, but also in the parade you would make floats. This was kind of like a Thanksgiving Day parade, but phallic floats were a popular form of float. And so this is somebody dressed up like a satyr riding in the parade on the phallus wagon. We actually have instructions from antiquity on how to make one of these, if you want to ride one around. Here's a man dressed as a woman carrying a giant phallus in the procession. Satyrs, imaginary party animals, half human, half animal, are the official escorts of the god, official patrons of the theater. Very misbehaved. This is a horrible, horrible satyr. Don't forget that the Greek gods enjoyed sex as much as humans did. In fact, sex with humans is more frequent than with other gods, among the gods, especially Zeus. Forgetting about his women conquests, here he is with his boy toy Ganymedes. So the gods also would enjoy this release from ordinary inhibitions and encouragement of the wholesome side of sexuality. So these expressions have a clear affinity with theater and also with the traditional comic theater. Comic costumes include the phallus. Here's a little theatrical souvenir, a terracotta that you could buy at the theater and take home with a comic character with his mask and phallus, inevitable. Here's a vase painting depicting comic actors also, and you notice that they have not only the dangling phallus and ugly masks, but also they have man breasts and pot bellies and distorted rumps. So they are grotesque characters. So regardless of the language of comedy, the visual aspect of classical comedy had this grotesque sexuality to it that was partly cultural and religious setting and partly literary and poetic use of that tradition for a contemporary theater. After 2,500 years of history, these complexities often leave us with problems of interpretation as well as translation. Let's take this passage from Aristophanes' Acharnians of 425 BC. Don't know whether you can see that, but the play's hero, Dicaeopolis, a displaced farmer, 6 years into the Peloponnesian War, trapped, like all other farmers, in the city for the duration of the war, has arranged a peace treaty for himself and his family alone, and celebrates his return to his farm with a miniature rural Dionysia festival celebrated with his wife, his daughter, and his slave, his whole family. Of course, it includes a phallic procession with a sexy song. This is how you honor Dionysus. This is my Loeb translation, which tries to render the Greek faithfully. And it opens up with a little hymn to Thales, friend of Bacchus, revel mate, nocturnal rambler, fornicator, pederast. Well, fornicator, moike, it's hard to translate. The word could be translated adulterer also because it refers to sex with illicit partners, that is, citizen wives and unmarried girls. So the god is an adulterer. A pederast, paiderastes, is also misleading since the Greek reference is to a man or a mature boy who falls in love with young boys. In classical Athens, this is a perfectly natural situation as long as you didn't actually have sex with the boy. If the boy was a freeborn boy, you could have sex with slaves, prostitutes, and foreigners all you wanted, but not free citizen, girls or boys. The Greeks thought it normal that most people will sexually desire members of their own gender, but they had more of a restriction on the status of the sex object than the gender of the sex object. No citizens. The next bit is a bit tougher to interpret. In his newly acquired peacetime, the hero Dicaeopolis looks forward to opportunities like catching his neighbor's slave girl stealing firewood and taking the opportunity to rape her, or as he metaphorically and poetically puts it, katagigartisai, literally to depit her like a piece of fruit, or as we used to say, deflower her. In reality, a rape of a citizen was illegal, but again, not of a slave. The most that could happen if you raped a slave was that the slave's owner could bill you for damages if you damaged their slave. But in this case, Thraita, the Thracian girl, literally was trespassing and stealing, so that in actuality, her master would not have much of a case to go to court with. So Dicaeopolis, in his return to the farm, this is the one thing that he thinks of that he can do now, that he couldn't do in the city, but when he returns to the farm, maybe he'll keep a lookout for the pretty slave girl who's trespassing on his land. It's interesting to look at some of the translations of this passage over the past 180 years. Mitchell, 1835, then to seize the sweet intruder, and with a kiss and nothing ruder, to compress her till her soul through her lips comes warm and whole. Now, I find that very creepy. Bilson, 1882, is even more exiguous, and tell her all your tender story with sweet caresses. 1910, a little closer. Far happier 'tis to me and sweeter, O Thales, Thales, some soft glade in, to woo the saucy arch-deceiving young Thratta, streamador his maiden. And from my woodland fells I meet her, descending with my faggots laden, and catch her up and ill-entreat her, and make her pay the fine for thieving. Ill-entreat gets pretty close to what's really going on here. This isn't a seduction or a tryst. Dickinson, 1957. Things get a bit more explicit. Stroll through my coverts and find a lovely girl there, trespassing, Streamadorus' daughter Thratta, to detain, to tumble over, and trespass you know where. That's not bad, the idea of sexual trespass as the punishment for physical trespass. So he gets part of it. And remember, in all this, Aristophanes too is not obscene, but rather metaphorical, expressing this action in terms of enjoying fruit. Parker, 1961, has a little more fun with it, putting the military imagery into his translation. Deciopolis imagines night patrols. He imagines the farmer lying in wait for the young girl. I guard against the raids and forays on my firewood led by sexy serving maids. So it's a game. When one comes jouncing down the hill with faggots in her hand, then larceny is petty, but the penalty is grand. I mount a sudden flank attack and take her by surprise. I enfilade her vineyard, then degrape her Spartan-wise. Nice try. I wonder, however, here about making Deciopolis, who is the emblem of peace and who wants nothing to do with war, and who's escaping back to the countryside to get away from war, would use military metaphor here. It seems to strike a discordant chord, unless the point is that he's transforming something that's actually military into a sexual exploit, which is okay. In other words, that wars become something that is expressed in terms of peacetime. Spartan-wise, as we'll see a little later, is a little bit sexually off, according to the mores of the time. But I'll get to that a little later, why it wouldn't be Spartan-wise. (1973), this is the period when the coast was clear if anybody wanted to translate faithfully and literally translate the obscenities. Sommerstein is a bit of a step backwards, reintroducing the idea of seduction and bypassing the rape issue. Grabbing her tight, for I never have known her to say, I will not, and lifting her up to amuse her, then having it off on the spot. So, it's a tryst. She's easy, but she does consent. This is dancing away from the rape issue, but not entirely, because the idea of consent is in there. And one thing that was going on in the 70s, the era of women's liberation, was the idea that women didn't have to put up with being groped and mashed, and they could say no, and would have to say no if they wanted to make something of it. So Sommerstein, I think, is being trendy according to the times. But this, again, was not settled at the time, whether saying no was enough. So he's protected in a way there. But again, when you're dealing with sexuality intrinsic to any culture in its own ways, and trying to translate it from one culture to another, there are all sorts of minefields and possibilities where you don't want to go to misrepresent something, but it's hard to know what's being represented sometimes. In this Aristophanes passage, I think it's truly hard to say what Aristophanes wanted to convey here. Is he characterizing his hero, Deciopolis, as a rapist that we should not approve of? Or is he inviting the audience to envy Deciopolis this opportunity? Phallic parades, like Dickeopolys's, a reflection of reality familiar to the audience, also remind us that Aristophanic sex and obscenity were visual as well as verbal. There was a big phallus on stage. Years ago, my translation of Acharnians, this scene of the phallus being brought on, produced at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. The director procured the largest dildo he could find to parade in the procession. He said he had to get it from Arkansas because he couldn't get something like that in Georgia. The audience disliked it. We had a little panel after the performance, and they did not like the phallus. They didn't like it not because it was offensive, but because it was commercial. It was store-bought. And their feeling was that Dickeopolis, who spends the whole first part of the play complaining about having to live in the city and how everything's so commercial there, he longs to go back to the farm where you don't use money and everything's homemade. They said he should have a homemade phallus. He should have made it out of paper mache. I thought it was a pretty profound reaction. Dickeopolis does hate commercialism and probably would have had a rustic-looking phallus in the original performance. We also had in that production, just as a side issue, I'll be talking about it again in a minute, but the guy that plays the warrior in the play, the antithesis of Dickeopolis, the man at war, General Lamachus, was played in that production by a very scary-looking guy. I mean, this guy epitomized the scary soldier and militarist. And I asked the director, where did you get a guy that looked like that for the play? And he goes, well, if you drive out of Atlanta 10 minutes in any direction, everybody looks like that. I'm from New England. I have these prejudices. In the end, however we choose to translate particular words or passages, it's also important to develop an understanding of how the sex and obscenity work thematically through a play and in Aristophanic comedy generally. Obscenity was good not only to celebrate the benefits of peace, fertility, and abundance, of pleasure and freedom, but also for mocking, insulting, exposing, and degrading someone, usually an authority figure. But not because the authority figure uses language like this. Quite the opposite. The comic heroes, who in Aristophanes are always fictitious people, never representing a real person, they are the ones that have all the obscenities in the play. It's the authority figures, it's the real people who often do represent actual contemporaries and who are the opponents of the comic hero in a contest of insults and ideas. They are the ones that are the target of the obscenities. Because obscenities directly refer to organs and acts that are taboo or otherwise cause anxiety, the obscenities are good for exposing. As throughout the play Knights, this is a prolonged contest in demagoguery between the populist politician Cleon, the first populist politician in history, represented as a Paphlagonian slave in the play. That is, he's a barbarian. A contest between him and an ordinary low-class guy who runs a hot dog stand. The conceit of the play, the allegory of the play, is that politics has gotten so awful and nasty and so low that the most disgusting, ignorant, nasty, amoral person would be the one to win the elections. So Cleon isn't, even Cleon is not the worst that you could possibly imagine. So in the play, a sausage seller, the hot dog vendor, emerges as the leading politician and has a contest of dirty politics with Cleon. So in this play, democracy has become a race to the bottom. The sausage seller is proud of not only being illiterate and ignorant, but of having been a boy prostitute and a thief. These are some insults. Paphlagon, the real politician, Cleon, and sausage seller, the comic hero. The play is full of this kind of one-upsmanship Cleon delivers what he considers a really good insult, and then the sausage seller tops it up with an obscene one. And these, of course, are caricatures of Cleon's actual statements, and then one up by obscenities encourages the listener of the play to remember these laughs at Cleon's expense when they leave the theater. So it really does, I think Aristophanes really is hoping to diminish Cleon's authority and popularity among the people. A winning asset being a prostitute and a thief. Sausage seller boasts of stealing meat in the marketplace when he was young. When one of the politicians saw me doing that, he said, "There's no way this boy won't someday govern the people." That was a good guess, but it's obviously how he figured it out. You perjured yourself about a robbery and took meat up your ass. And here's what future is in store for the sausage seller after he becomes all-powerful. These are the good things of the political power broker. In real life, Cleon seems to have launched prosecutions against political enemies for just this sort of thing, including Aristophanes, for having prostituted themselves as boys. That's one of his campaign issues, Cleon, to stop the buggers. Sausage seller accuses him of stopping the buggers. These are men that allow themselves to be penetrated by other men. The reason you're doing that is so they won't become politicians and challenge you. That is why the sausage seller calls the people in the audience the city of the reamed, because if they listen to Cleon, if they listen to politicians like that, then they are no better than the buggard. This characterization is part of a consistent pattern that associates heterosexuality, youth, and beauty with traditional culture and the timeless countryside and peace and prosperity. And on the other hand, scatology, elderly heterosexuality, passive homosexuality are associated with modernism, the city, warfare, and democratic misrule. For not only are demagogic leaders boy buggers who have grown up to be man-reamers, but the people they dominate, the citizens of Athens, have therefore become the city of the reamed. If you read H.L. Mencken, a great commentator on American politics, writing at the turn of the 20th century, once remarked, "The American people deserve to get what they want, and get it good and hard," referring to our democratic system and low politicians who promise things, and that we, getting it good and hard kind of, to me, echoes this Aristophanic idea that people who listen to demagogues are the reamed, metaphorically. In the end, the comic heroes liberate themselves and other decent people from enthrallment to such baseness. In the finale to Acharnians, General Lamachus packs his knapsack and spear to do battle in the wintry mountains, while Dicaeopolis acquires 2 girls representing peace treaties. These are peace treaties imagined as girls to help him celebrate a banquet and a drinking contest. As the chorus puts it, contrasting the lives of Lamachus on the one hand and Dicaeopolis on the other. Which would you choose, you men in the audience? The life of peace, to go back to the farm, or the life of campaigning? The finale of Knights is similar. Demos personifying the electorate, demos as in democracy. Mr. Demos, who has been enthralled and enchanted by Cleon, who's taken over the household of Athens, is rejuvenated back to his good old days when Athens defeated the Persians and won an empire. The American equivalent today of the good old days, make America great again. Well, when was that? Well, the Greatest Generation, World War II, or the 1950s when we didn't have these culture wars. So economically, maybe World War II, and culturally, the 1950s. In Athens, these were the glory days of Marathon and the Persian Wars, Salamis, 2 generations before Aristophanes. And for promising never to listen to another demagogue, Demos gets sexual enjoyment as his reward. Sausage seller, who's now become a good advisor to the Demos, quizzes him about what he's going to do in the future if any demagogue tries to hoodwink him, and he gives the right answers now. He can't believe that he was ever so stupid as to listen to Cleon. The sausage seller says, on that understanding, please accept this split-bottom chair and a well-hung boy to carry it for you. And if you ever get the urge, use the boy as your split bottom too. Happy me, I'm really starting to relive the good old days. He also gets a couple of girls representing peace treaties. Okay if I lay them down and ratify them. These girls, like all female characters in Greek drama, comedy and tragedy, were of course played by men or boys, masked and costumed like girls, complete with body stocking and attached breasts and genitals if they were supposed to be naked. So there was no actual nakedness in these plays. But the effect was still quite believable in a large amphitheater setting. The verb that I've translated here, lay down and ratify, kata triakontotisai, a word invented for the occasion, is really untranslatable. The prefix kata, down or over, is often used in verbs of sexual penetration, while triakonta means 30, the time span of the longest Greek peace treaties. 30 years was the longest the classical Greeks could ever imagine not being at war. So this is a good one. It's a memorable coinage, a great word, Rabelaisian word, and a great way to encourage the spectators to think positively about peace and associate it with sex, as well as with good food and good wine. The finale of these plays, eating, drinking, and having sex, those are the rewards for the good life, the life that we could have if we stopped listening to politicians like Cleon, and if we stopped fighting wars against the wrong people. Often, these metaphorical associations are even more elaborate. Readers of Acharnians will recall the Megarian scene, a Megarian victim of an Athenian wartime embargo, Megara, a neighboring small state that Athens put an economic embargo on, comes to Dicaeopolis' market to trade his 2 young daughters for a bunch of garlic and a peck of salt. He's disguised the daughters as piggies, koiroi, which for Athenians we would call pussy in our slang. They call them piggies, we call them pussies. At least Donald Trump would call it a pussy. The whole scene revolves around puns on these sense of the word. He's selling his daughters as koiroi, piggies. They're not real piggies, they're not real food, but they're sex objects. This was another problematic Emory, element of the Emory production. The women who signed up to perform the play refused to perform this scene. They didn't want to be piggies being sold, wearing snouts and oinking for the man. So they wanted to write an alternative scene in which cocks, little boys, are sold as cocks by their mother, reversing the gender of the scene. Again, the audience didn't like this, and during the panel discussion at the end, they said, no, we get it. We understand about the girls. We thought the boys was forced because boys are not in that position as victims. And that's the point of the scene. Whatever Aristophanes' deepest intent when he let this ride with the audience, we cannot know. It's a work of art. We interpret it as we see it. Whether it was edgy or not, what to make of the Megarian. What if today we put that scene on and it wasn't a Megarian but a Syrian refugee or an Afghan refugee or a Holocaust refugee or whatever. And you can see how the topicality might change the force of the scene. Sometimes these sexy personifications get involved in audience participation. In Peace, which actually celebrates the peace treaty of 421, the companions of the goddess Peace, whom the hero Trygaeus rescues from war, are the attractive girls Opora and Theoria, which I've translated holiday and cornucopia. Like Dicaeopolis, Trygaeus, whose name alludes to the verb trugon, to harvest, is also used of procreative sex, is rejuvenated sexually as part of the rewards for his heroic transcendence, and he receives Opora, cornucopia, as his wife. She embodies peace and fertility, and had been a symbol since the dawn of Greek literature of plenty of ripe fruits and ripe bodies in the prime of life. As always, peace is associated only with wholesome sexuality, marriage, fertility, abundant crops. As for Theoria, her partner in the play, Holiday, raunchy sexuality is her fate. Trygaeus gives her to the council to enjoy. The city council actually sat in a special section of the theater right up front. So this way the city can enjoy sex in the city fashion, a la hired girls at symposia. Wives or slave maids in the country are the other side of it. Cornucopia, the wife of the hero in the climax of the play, is a decent marriage, whereas the city council gets what amounts to a prostitute to enjoy. And then there is Reconciliation herself, personified in the Chorus of Acarnians as a beautiful girl. The imagery here is worth considering. This is the vision of reconciliation, the chorus invoking her to come into the theater, reconciliation of the war, to come as a goddess into the theater, and imagines how she would look. And this is a combination in the metaphor of attractive girl and agricultural bounty. But it's poetic imagery. This is the earlier and more political play. The hero's wife is reconciliation, but only the chorus only imagines her as a young girl, and their sex is in these metaphors. In Lysistrata, 14 years later, in 411, the heroine leads reconciliation on stage in physical form as a naked young girl, and parts of her body, punning on geographical place names, are used to negotiate the territorial elements of the peace settlement, which we see going on in front of us. The Athenian and Spartan ambassadors are by this point so horny that they are mesmerized by reconciliation and will agree to do anything to get back their wives and to have sex again. Fortunately, ethnic stereotypes come in handy. The Athenians thought that Spartans were partial to anal intercourse. This is a stereotype of Spartans among the Athenians, whereas the Athenians were attracted to the front. So this works out well in the negotiations. The Spartans want the backside and the Athenians want the front side. And after they've ratified the peace treaty, everything's going to be fine. There's not going to be an argument. Again, this is why Spartan-wise earlier isn't so good in view of the current stereotypes. But Aristophanes, again, is trying to express a very serious issue. what would the terms of a peace treaty be in the war in terms that are funny, memorable, and bring things down to earth in a way that both the Spartans and the Athenians could understand, to humanize it. And what's more humanizing than sex? In any event, the fun wouldn't last much longer. Already during Aristophanes' later career, obscenity had begun to be much less frequent in comedy. There was still sex aplenty in comedy, but it was much more decently portrayed and described, and begins to tend toward depiction of marriage rather than extramarital sex. And it's described in virtually metaphorical language that verges away from any direct depiction of sexuality. And toward the end of the 4th century, the later century, 25 years after Aristophanes' death, we'd be hard put to find any explicit description of sex. The comic phallus stops appearing on the comic stage around the same time. And people now went to the theater not for political satire, but to escape politics. And we have the era of theater that we recognize as a European theatrical tradition, with the crude, boisterous, transgressive Aristophanes safely in the rearview mirror. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Before we head over, there's a reception next door, but before we head over, Dr. Henderson has agreed to take a few questions. Surely a provocative topic.
They're all stunned to silence.
Oh, excuse me.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about the very oblique translations of Acharnian 263 following. You went through some of those, and it was apparent that translators, especially into English, of Greek works, didn't think that they were documenting what was in the Greek. That was not really their job for a long time. So you have a very literary tradition of translation into English, at least. Less so, I think, in German, but also in French. So these people didn't think it was their job to tell the reader exactly what was in the text. Now, it would, of course, interest me as the general editor of the Loeb series to know what your theory of translation is and whether you think it is the job of the translator to document what is in the text. That's really hard, especially in the case of obscenities, as we know, because the semantic frameworks that are set off by naughty words are often really specific to the time and context of those naughty words. So if archaeologists come in 2,000 years and unearth the Trump footage, they might even think it might be hard for them to construe why such language was even controversial, say, on the basis of a Google search of those words on the internet that existed in that time. So it's really hard to pinpoint why certain words said by certain actors in certain contexts are so interesting, scintillating, sexual, and given all that, and the loadedness, the thickness, the normative thickness of sexual language, how would you approach that translation problem?
There's a lot in that question. Thank you. To the latter, Potter Stewart was right that the eye of the beholder is important. And you have Trump now using what he calls locker room language. And his defenders say it's only locker room language. Who could be offended by this? To me, this kind of language 10 years ago would have really been unthinkable. But now it's possible to say it's not so bad. It's just the way boys talk. So within the culture, there are differences of opinion about what's proper and what isn't. The translator then, has even worse problem, because who are you translating for, even in your own audience? When the Loeb Library was first set up, James Loeb wanted to put forth all that was best, and he said, I want to put real literature in front of the Latin and Greek. He didn't think of it as translating. He thought of it as Latin and Greek on one side, which any educated person, of course, would be able to read, and on the other, good English versions. But he didn't want necessarily translations, not only of offensive material, but any material. He was fine with, putting in early very free translations, 17th century translations. It didn't match the Latin and Greek very closely. But now I think that the mission of the library is to be faithful to the facing translation. If I were translating these plays for a theater without the facing translation, they would be different. But I think our readers now want to use it either to help them read the Latin or Greek, or to be confident that that what's on the English side more or less conveys what's on the Latin and Greek. It's a fiction, of course, but there are degrees of fictionality.
Thank you very much, Professor Henderson. I want to take the question a little bit different direction, and it concerns the general relationship between humor and obscenity to everyday Athenian life, with respect especially to Athenian democracy. And what was sort of intimated in your talk, and I'm not sure whether you hold this or whether it just came out in the talk a little bit, was that obscenity in comedy is something of the icing on the cake. And the cake is a more serious Athenian democracy. The cake is Plato and Aristotle. The cake is democracy. The cake is rational argumentation. And that this was something that was permitted. It was something that was tolerated, the obscenity, the comedy. Is that your view, or do you think that there's a more intimate relationship between comedy and obscenity and the civic life of the Athenians? You mentioned, for example, that the largest gathering that happened in an Athenian year was things like this, right? It was these sorts of speeches. It was sort of this obscenity and comedy. Do you think that Aristophanes, as it were, wasn't just sort of an escapist, wasn't just sort of a window dressing, wasn't just sort of a facade, but that he was absolutely, and the kind of comedy that he was portraying was absolutely central to the rhetorical force within an Athenian democracy?
I think in terms of the theater and the poetry, the genre that he was writing in, that these elements are traditional. They might not have been raised to such an artistic pinnacle as they were in the 5th century. And Aristophanes was considered one of the greatest Greek poets. So it wasn't like everybody was writing comedies like that. So there may be things in his comedy that are very unusually good. But theater as a traditional entertainment of the people and a religious phenomenon had always contained this, what Aristotle called the iambic element of mockery and transgressive language. Not everybody thought it was appropriate. Plato associated it with a democracy, that this stuff was in there because people have no taste. If we really had decent people, they wouldn't enjoy this sort of thing. But that's Plato. Aristophanes certainly wasn't a gutter snipe. I mean, he was prosperous enough to be on the list to serve as a counselor for his deme. We have him on inscriptions. He was a poet, and that wasn't a proletarian thing to do. So, again, eye of the beholder. But the democracy did, I'm sure, protect an extension of festive license, of obscenity and boisterous fun, extend it into politics in ways that wouldn't be permitted in real democratic discourse. The insults that the fictional characters engage in wouldn't be permitted outside the comic theater. But they are extensions of those insults. They're sometimes taking them literally.
Can I just ask a quick question on that? I've always wondered, to what degree do we have any knowledge? Some things in modern audiences, when a comic says something dirty or profane, it's funny because we all know those words, but we don't say them in public. Sometimes there are words that are truly shocking, and there's a big difference. Do we have any sense for Aristophanes which of those two it was?
No, I don't think so. And you know, you can simply tell sometimes by the context. One of the routines in Aristophanes is to describe something in mild terms and then have a shocking climax using a word. And there were the equivalent of four-letter words. And they're the same four-letter words as we have, except for piss. There was no, the Greeks didn't consider that obscene. Like the Brits either. I think the Brits don't consider piss on a par with the other four-letter words. Who knows?
One of the perspectives I have, and I'm not sure what you think about it, but I see Aristophanes as writing satire, and I think of other satirists, for example, Swift, Rabelais, also using the same type of language. And it seems to me that what satirists are doing there is to try to emphasize the animal side of human nature as a way of attacking pretentiousness of their targets. So that's one of the explanations that I tend to see in Aristophanes.
It's a very good observation. Comic heroes are anything but pretentious. Their targets are pretentious. So yes, it's a way of exposing the emperor's clothes, really, phenomenon. But to do it in a memorable, poetic way, not just four-letter words. Most of these obscenity in Aristophanes is very elaborate, poetic inventiveness, and you make something out of it.
You know, it's interesting. I'd like to make a comment rather than ask a question. When we're reading literature like this, it so reflects, as you and I talked earlier, the time that we're reading it in. And as a teacher who deals with this, one of the most serious issues to me, and then hearing you recite some of the passages becomes not the obscenity at all, but the sensitivity to the issues of sexual abuse. And it's so hard because I don't think you realize it as much when you're reading it. But when I would hear you say this stuff out loud, even in the context, it made me uncomfortable. And I was wondering what the students felt, but particularly what the women students felt. And it'd just be interesting to hear what other people and what you thought about how that resonates today.
I like to try to translate things into current form. That's why I was saying the Megarian, it's okay if he's an ancient Megarian, but if you put him in terms of a modern person in that very situation, a Syrian refugee selling his daughters, hoping to get a bite of food, and talking to someone from a country that forbids refugees, forbids immigrants. That would be much more disturbing. But if you think back to Aristophanes' audience, his audience were victimizing the Megarians. To them, this was current events. I mean, Megarians were starving because of their blockade. So here's the character arguing against the war and how much damage it's doing, and you have a scene illustrating that. It's a funny scene, but how funny is it? I mean, I think this is Aristophanes. You know, he punches you in the nose and makes you laugh at the same time. But people then they think, why am I laughing at this?
I wonder if any of our students wanted to comment on Dr. Farrell's question.
I just wondered how the passages resonated with, especially the young women in the audience, with regard to our heightened sensitivities now to sexual abuse, both female and male abuse.
I was just gonna say, it was definitely like shocking. Just I wasn't expecting it to like go up on the board, and it did. But I mean, yeah, I don't know. It was just surprising, I guess.
One of Dr. Farrell's points was the difference between reading it and hearing it. I don't know if anybody thought about that.
I felt a little uncomfortable about reading some of these, so I didn't, you know. I read some of them, though, because I do think it's important to hear and I guess the Athenians would react somewhat the same way.
Dr. Green?
This is completely off topic. Thank you again for your talk. I just had a quick question. You had brought up parrhesia and the Athenian ideal of free speech, and I was just wondering if in any of Aristophanes' comedies, it always seems as if that obscenity and that sort of invective is the property of a certain class of citizen who is franchised, as you said, your Strepsiades, your Dicaiopoulos, and so on. And I was wondering if there are any examples in his corpus of a parrhesia of that sort being used by non-franchised characters or characters who are of a different class, and if there's different reactions on the stage or it's looked down upon. Is there a qualitative difference in the way that obscenity or invective is used when it's not the typical Athenian franchised male?
Women, I mean, respectable women, as opposed to foreigners and slaves, only come into comedy late. They only come in Lysistrata is the first time. And Lysistrata is the first non-mythical woman portrayed in Western history. She uses obscenities in a very effective way, and her old elderly partners who occupy the Acropolis also do. And the men consider that bold of them. And they say, we are being bold and we're confronting you, and it's your fault. We like to be decorous, but you forced us out of our houses and forced us to take action. So I think there's a little hint there that this might not be realistic, and that it's the boldness of women and their encroaching on male prerogatives that permits it. But there really isn't enough raw material there. But there's nothing in the plays to suggest that there was anything wrong with women per se in using this language. But there might be a hint that anybody using it is being aggressive.
Let me give the last question to Dr. Strasser, although I'm sure Dr. Henderson will take questions at the reception.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture, and it reminded me, I appreciate you going through the older translations. And I remember as a student trying to read those and not knowing what was going on at all, you know. And then but it's very obvious what's going on with your translations, which begs me to ask the question, you know, if our perception of the ancient Greeks might be more of a construct, in the sense of like the cake, Dr. Jensen mentioned, you know, we sort of imagine, you know, these guys, you know, reciting the funeral oration while they talk to each other and things like, you know, and Homeric odes, but that in fact wasn't the case. And a good example of that is the National Museum in Athens, which if you go through the basement, the majority of the pottery is homoerotic stuff. It's men with boys, but we don't see any of that in the art books or the, you know. And I wonder if the same has happened from European constructs of the ancient literature of, you know, this is what we're going to teach you. We're not going to.
Yes, absolutely.
This was far more, the ancient Greeks were far more used to seeing this stuff and hearing this stuff than we imagine.
Well, they're model cultures and held up as examples for various reasons. People didn't want to hear it, especially in the German Enlightenment period, the Romantic period when the Greeks were considered an ideal culture. And that art is still hidden in the basement in most museums. But the Greeks, classical Greeks, are one of the 3 greatest erotic art cultures in history, along with Japan and China. They have this very rich, Japan and India. And they have a very rich erotic pictorial culture that we should be more familiar with. But again, it's not of much interest to people. The way to see it is in the basement of the museum. So that environment surrounds Greeks. They're used to seeing it in seeing phalluses, and door bells in ancient Greece were often phallic. And everybody had a little phallus outside their front door in the form of Hermes, a little statue. Hermes guards boundaries. Going in and out of a house, you'd want Hermes to be good luck, but Hermes was nothing but a pillar with a phallus on it. And again, evil spirits won't go in your house. Hermes will protect them, protect you. So you couldn't get away from it. It wasn't something that was unthinkable. In terms of language, and in terms of the propriety of sexuality, that's where the slipping points were, was using an explicit sexual term, a violation of decorum. And I think probably it would be if you used that language to someone, as it would be today. We have language that avoids this. I mean, if you're in the doctor's office and he says, I'm going to look at your penis, that's okay. But if he says, I'm going to look at your cock, this is totally inappropriate. A doctor shouldn't say that. Not in the doctor's office. I mean, maybe a brothel, but not a doctor's office. So it's all, but who knows what these registers are? And 90% of the Aristophanic material is hard to say for sure what that valence would be outside of the comic stage.
We are going to move the conversation next door to food and drinks, but please join me in thanking Dr. Henderson one last time.